Hello and welcome to Casual Learning. I'm your host, John Bannan. Let's deal with Debunking Atheists, Volume 5. Today, in this episode, I want to go over one atheistic argument. Now, this is a serious atheistic argument, and it's up there with the problem of evil. And they both have a similar solution. I call this particular argument the genie in the bottle argument. And this atheistic argument goes like this. Well, because God is all good or omnibenevolent, he should do whatever it is you want, especially things that you want which are objectively good. So, like a genie in the bottle who grants wishes to the holder of the bottle, why doesn't God just grant our wishes? Why doesn't God do whatever we ask him to do, especially when the things that we're asking for are objectively good? So, for instance, why not appear to us and prove that he's real? That would seem to be an objectively good thing to do. Or why not give me the perfect proof for God's existence that I would understand and that nobody would disagree with? And because of that, everybody would agree that God is real or God exists. Or, why don't you give me whatever I want? Especially if I'm a good person, especially if I'm asking for good things. I don't understand why you don't do that for me. You seem powerful enough to give me whatever it is I want. Why don't you do that? So atheists will say, well, the reason God doesn't do that, give you those wishes that you ask for, is because he doesn't exist. He's not there. So he can't give you those things. However, that's wrong. That's not accurate at all. And there's good reason why God doesn't give you whatever it is you want. And that's because God is not a genie in a bottle. God does not have a magic wand like Pope Francis stated in the media a few years ago. God's not a magician. And why is that? Why isn't God a magician or a genie in a bottle? I thought God could do everything. And the answer is this. God is uncaused. And it's extremely important for a theist to remember this. That little 3-word sentence gets you out of a lot of atheistic arguments, even serious ones like the genie in the bottle argument. Because God is uncaused, God's power to create physical reality is also uncaused. It's part of God. God's power to create physical reality is part of God, and God is uncaused, and so that power is also uncaused. But let's be clear about things here. God does not use magic. God uses a real but uncaused power to create physical reality. That's not magic. So when God creates something or does something at your request, God has to use God's uncaused power to do that. He doesn't have a magic wand and just boom, does whatever it is you want. He uses that uncaused power. It's a real thing. It's a real uncaused power. But because it's uncaused, God can't change it. You can't change an uncaused thing. It's not subject to change because it was never the result of change to begin with. It's not a caused thing. So God is stuck with his uncaused power to create physical reality. And whatever toolbox that God gets in order to create physical reality, he's stuck with that. That's all he gets. He can't create his own power to create. It's an uncaused power. So whatever the toolbox is, that's what he has. Now, that doesn't mean that God is not omnipotent or not all powerful or that God is limited. And the reason is because omnipotence really only refers to all real powers. Now, there are hypothetical powers that you could come up with that are logically impossible powers, like God creating a stone that even God can't lift. But these are illusory powers. They're fake powers. They're not real powers. So God has all real powers. God doesn't have illusory fake powers that somebody, some clever atheist comes up with. Just because you come up with an idea of a power doesn't mean that God has to have it if it's an impossible power or it's not a logically possible power. So when you're dealing with God's power to create physical reality, you're talking about an uncaused power. That means God doesn't have the power to change it. There is no real power to change the uncaused. So it's not a limitation that God is stuck with an uncaused toolbox. It's just that a greater toolbox would be illusory. It wouldn't be a real thing. There is no real power anywhere that could expand that toolbox. So God isn't limited in that sense. God is still omnipotent. It's just that God is stuck with the uncaused toolbox, and God can't change it because it's uncaused. Very simple logic, but very accurate, 100% true logic. All right, so what's in God's uncaused toolbox? Well, I don't know everything that's in God's uncaused toolbox, but I do know of some things that are in God's uncaused toolbox, and we know them because of the universe. So we can say things like energy and matter and space-time and the universe and gravity and all the physics that we know about. We could say that this is part of God's uncaused toolbox. These are some of the tools that he has to create physical reality, and these are uncaused tools. Now, the physical reality itself is caused. God creates them. But we're talking about the metaphysical toolbox that God uses to create physical realities. So, God has an uncaused power to create physical reality. And the name I give this uncaused power to create all that is logically possible in physical reality, I call it everythingness. meaning that God has an uncaused power to create in physical reality everything that is logically possible. Everythingness. Um, Now, for a better understanding of how everythingness fits into reality, you can review the cosmological argument, the dichotomy of existence. Now, I've done previous videos on this particular cosmological argument, but I've done another video on all the cosmological arguments on a separate YouTube channel besides this one. So why don't you search this other YouTube channel that I have called Cosmological Arguments. And that YouTube channel is dedicated to listing and explaining the, at this point, 16 cosmological arguments for the existence of God, one of which happens to be the dichotomy of existence, where I talk about this concept of everythingness. Now, everythingness is the power to create everything that is logically possible in physical reality. Well, that has a certain characteristic to it, which is that when you think about everything that is logically possible in physical reality, it's clear that the things that are less complex must outnumber the things that are more complex, because there's more less complex things in the whole realm of everythingness than there is the more complex things. Now, that should be pretty obvious to you. But that's also an aspect of the uncaused power to create, or everythingness, that God also has to deal with. So, uh, because of God's uncaused power, a lot of things, a lot of less complex things, have to outnumber more complex things. And that's what we see in our universe. So, more complex things, such as miracles, are very infrequent. A miracle is really a violation of the laws of physics. That is a complex thing to pull off in a universe like ours with um, our general laws of physics. So, because of this uncaused power and what that means, especially in terms of everythingness, miracles are few and far between. And it's not because God chooses not to do them for you. It's that God has this metaphysical toolbox, and one of the consequences of that is that complex things like miracles have to be less frequent than less complex things like what we see in our universe. So God really, first of all, God isn't a genie. He doesn't use magic. He uses an uncaused power to create. But on top of that, he has this uncaused metaphysical toolbox of creation, and it has consequences. And one of those consequences is God can't do miracles frequently because of everythingness and the aspect of everythingness that makes those things less frequent. So God's not a magician, and he's not about to simply grant all your wishes whenever you ask, because these are miracles, and they are by nature infrequent. So those are good reasons why God isn't a genie in a bottle. And this is why you don't get every wish you want granted. Such as, well, God, why don't you peer in front of me and prove that you exist? Wasn't that a good thing? Well, sure, it would be, except that God is not a genie in a bottle, doesn't use magic, and that would be an extremely complex miracle that only occurs extremely infrequently under everythingness. Okay. Another point is God doesn't have to do what you say. So you can't force God to do any miracle that you want. Uh, God is the creator of physical reality. God is your creator. God is the uncaused reality of existence. Uh, God is far, far infinitely greater than you are. You're a created being. God is an uncaused, a supreme being, supreme infinite being. So God doesn't take orders from you. You're the creation, not the creator. It's not going to be a situation where the tail is wagging the dog. So it's really an absurd notion to think that God is simply going to be your servant and grant your wishes or miracles whenever you want them to be granted. Um, that's the tail wagging the dog, and that makes really no logical sense. So God has this uncaused power to create physical reality, but with strings attached. And that string is that he has an uncaused metaphysical toolbox with certain consequences like everythingness. And that's what he has to use. There's no power that exists that would allow God to change or expand that metaphysical toolbox. Okay, so again, uh, the notion that God is uncaused is critical in to understand in defeating atheistic arguments, even serious arguments like the genie in the bottle argument or the problem of evil. And I've done a video on that. And that you get out of that the same way as you get out of this, which is that God has to use evolution to create human beings, and that brings with it evil. But it's better that that evil be allowed in order for human beings to exist. So God chooses the greater good and allows evolution and evil because it allows human beings to exist. So, so remember this principle. It's very, very important. It's probably the number one thing that you need to know and remember about God, especially when arguing with non-believers or atheists. All right. If you have any questions or comments, please leave below. Please press the subscribe button. I appreciate it. And I hope you learned something. And take care.